When a game's fantastic and everybody wants a sequel, the worst thing in the world is when they make one and it doesn't stick the landing. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on Gameranx, 20 game sequels that disappointed. Starting off with number 20, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 from 2023. For months leading up to this game's release, there was rampant speculation about what it was even going to be. One of the most commonly repeated rumors was that the game was going to be an expansion pack to the second game, and that the development time given to it was about half of the regular Call of Duty timeframe. Activision did not want expansion pack money, though. They wanted to release a full $70 special edition Spicy Meatball. So, that's what we got. I don't know if any of the reports or rumors are actually true, but the meatball seemed undercooked. This game seemed rushed out. I'm just going to say it. It's barely a game. The campaign is especially pathetic. Only taking around 2 to 3 hours to finish, and mostly padded out with Warzone maps. All the multiplayer maps are just OG Modern Warfare 2 maps that got reused also. And there's a zombies mode with a reused Warzone map again. Like, it's shocking what they think they can get away with here. But it is Call of Duty, so people do buy it. With all that said, there are ways that the game is still somehow an improvement over Modern Warfare 2. Like, the multiplayer changes, for the most part, do make for a more fun game. And the old maps hit a hell of a lot better than the newer, crappier ones. So, it's not all bad. That's why we're kind of starting out with it, rather than putting it at, like, number one. But for a $70 game, it is shocking how little content there actually is here. At number 19 is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. The previous Deus Ex, Human Revolution, was a return to form for the series, a true successor in the way Invisible War just wasn't. And I mean, we could have easily put Invisible War on the list, but it's just kind of bad in a lot of ways, whereas Mankind Divided is a lot more disappointing because all the pieces are in place for it to be the next great Deus Ex game. For one thing, it looks great, and it still has some of the best environmental design in the entire series. The concept is interesting too. It's about brewing resentment between augmented people and non-augmented people, and while the themes of prejudice are a little heavy-handed at best, there's good ideas. Like, that is the root of a good story.
More than a few around.
The problem is, the game isn't finished. It's like half a game. While most Deus Ex games have multiple hub areas and fairly lengthy campaigns, this one's pretty short. It's got one hub, ends on a cliffhanger, and that's it. Almost nothing in the main plot is resolved. The main bad guy feels like a starter villain, not the main event. The whole thing just feels incomplete in a deeply disappointing way. Even if the plot ever does finally get followed up on, it doesn't excuse how short and inconclusive this game felt. It's not a bad game. It's just not weird at all to call it disappointing. It is very disappointing. At number 18 is Dark Souls 2. Everyone has their hot takes about the Souls series. Every single game is simultaneously the best and worst game in the series, but come on, you know the real answer here. It's Dark Souls 2. It's not the worst game ever or anything. Like, there's plenty to like about it. I would even say it's a good game. It has the most creative multiplayer in the series, for one, but even fans of the game have to admit it's got some problems. Instead of building on the work they'd done from the previous game, the dev team behind Dark Souls 2 decided to reinvent the wheel, and everything just feels slightly off in this game. It constantly zigs where the first game zagged. It's hard to explain exactly what makes this game feel so off compared to the first, but if you've played these games, you definitely know. It could have expanded on stuff people really liked from the first game, like the interconnected world, but they focused on like oddball stuff, like this complex darkness thing that's mostly pointless because they cut the entire lighting system out of the game. I mean, it deserves some credit for being creative and experimental, but what everyone actually wanted was a bigger, better Dark Souls, and that's not this. Even with its flaws, it is still better than most Souls-likes. I want to just outwardly say it's a good game. But after the heights of the first game and having it basically take over the industry and invent a genre, it's just disappointing to play after the first. At number 17 is Halo 5 Guardians. 343's tenure with the Halo franchise has had its ups and downs. Some games have been better than others, but if there's one game in the franchise that could be considered a straight-up failure, it's Halo 5 Guardians. There was a lot of hype going in, too. The Hunt the Truth stuff they were putting out before release legitimately got people pumped. And the premise of a guy hunting after Master Chief could have been pretty damn interesting, actually. But the final product, just a big load of nothing. To say people found the story of Halo 5 disappointing would be a pretty big understatement. Like, it just straight up sucked. It was, like, incoherent. It made some bizarre character choices, and the titular Guardians barely factored into anything.
You allow them an audience. You restore them the name of Hearts Cortana.
Warden, don't.
Like, it was such a mess that the next game, Halo Infinite, completely rebooted the story from that game, resolving the Reclaimer trilogy stuff from Halo 4 and 5 off screen. And yeah, Halo Infinite story is also kind of a mess, but not on the level of Halo 5. The new, like, Call of Duty-fied environment didn't really feel like Halo, and multiplayer introduced a bunch of microtransaction nonsense. People were just not happy with this one at all, and even now it's the black sheep of the Halo series. Sometimes games that were hated at release get a critical reappraisal later, but not Guardians, and that should tell you basically everything you need to know. At number 16 is Dead Space 3. Hey, here's an idea. How about we take a beloved horror franchise and remove most of its defining features? Oh, the unique weapons and guns? Replace them with generic build-a-guns. The iconic monsters? How about kind of boring zombies instead? Sound good? Or the famous limb-cutting system? Why would you want that? It barely matters anymore. And just forget about that tense, slow-paced, horrific atmosphere. Now Mission Command is barking in your ears constantly while your co-op partner banters with Isaac.
One way or another, I'm taking that shock point drive.
I'm not gonna let you kill Ellie.
You were just fine letting her die as Danik's hostage.
You knew what was at stake.
And here's the thing. In any other game, this stuff really wouldn't be a problem, but it's Dead Space 3. You're going to go into this one with specific expectations. Like, Dead Space does something different from everyone else. That's why Dead Space is Dead Space. But instead of evolving and following that thread, Dead Space 3 just throws out the playbook. And it's weird because it's all in a desperate, misguided attempt to attract a wider audience, and it doesn't work that way in games. There's a million games. You kind of have to have a thing, and they threw the thing out. The whole gun crafting system just annihilates the careful balance of the original games. The story, I mean, there's aspects of it that aren't bad, but generally it's kind of stupid. Some of the new co-op elements are clever, but not enough to make up for everything that's not there anymore. I mean, after Dead Space 2, which was great, just an incredible expansion on everything Dead Space was without throwing out what Dead Space was. This was just a huge disappointment. Like, it's a case of EA trying to make something more mainstream but ruining it in the process. And from a mile away, you should be able to understand why that's a bad idea.
Whatever this is,
The Codex! It's the key to saving everything! Meet me at the silo and don't stop for anyone!
At number 15 is Splinter Cell Double Agent. There are other games in the series that are more divisive, like Conviction for its simplified stealth elements and Blacklist for replacing Sam's voice actor, the legendary Michael Ironsides with Generic Man, I think that's his name.
You just worry about a viable spot for exfil, something here. Everyone clear? Let's make this prep quick.
This is a series that was on the downslide for a while, but man, going from Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, the height of the franchise, and one of the best stealth games ever, to Double Agent was a shock. Just to be clear, I'm not talking about the Xbox, PlayStation 2, GameCube version of it, which was actually a completely different game. I'm talking about the next-gen versions of Double Agent. That's the actual bad one. It plays like the old games, but something feels off. Missions are small, they're linear and awkwardly paced. The story is just dumb. Like, you know when something's trying to be edgy and it makes it not edgy? Yeah, it's that. The base missions, where you have to sneak around a terrorist base while undercover, they're sloppy, super awkward. I mean, it's a game, it just feels second rate in every conceivable way. It's one of those games that was destined for the dollar bin. The quality just was not there. And it's one of those games that, like a lot of stuff on this list, isn't necessarily terrible on its own, but when you compare it to the previous game in the series, it just does not compare. Chaos Theory was so good, and this was not the follow-up anyone asked for. At number 14 is Mortal Kombat versus the DC universe. I can hear you already. MK versus DC isn't a main Mortal Kombat game, it's a spin-off. Nice try, but if you look at the official numbering, this is actually a canon entry. It is Mortal Kombat 8. Wikipedia says so. It's a teen-rated Mortal Kombat. I could stop there, but that's actually far from this game's only problems. Pretty much the only good thing this game managed to do was return the series to its 2D fighting roots. And some of the designs for the Mortal Kombat characters continued into the far, far superior Mortal Kombat 9, but that's about it. Fighting is stiff and awkward as hell. There's a bunch of tacked on gimmicky stuff. The DC characters in general look pretty bad. The whole concept is absolutely absurd. Who asked for this? Like, really? I mean, at least it has a story mode, but at best it kind of looks like a dry run for the much better one in Mortal Kombat 9. At best. Like, that's the most positive way to spin it. It's lame. And that pretty much describes everything about the game. It's just pathetic from top to bottom. At number 13 is Dead Rising 4. I'd complain that this game is just another example of the misguided trend of Japanese companies handing their franchises off to Western developers on the cheap, who basically ruin them. But they already did that with Dead Rising 2, and that game's actually pretty good. It wasn't until Dead Rising 4 that the series was actually killed. It's a game that strips the series of its identity and replaces it with, well, nothing. So in the end, all that's left is a pretty forgettable zombie game with some minor open world elements. The game was meant to be the triumphant return of Frank West, the protagonist from the first game, and while it's meant to be a sequel, it feels more like a reboot because everything is different and much more generic this time around. Frank West just acts like a lesser Will Arnett character, but not voiced by Will Arnett, so you don't even have that.
Just kind of stuffy in here, don't you think? A little fresh air, you know.
And it just feels wrong, you know? Like, this isn't a particularly good impression of Will Arnett, but neither is the game.
Beyond that, the entire time mechanic that defined the rest of the series, just gone. And instead of having a full open world to explore and screw around in, just feels mechanical and linear. They even took out the psychos. Everybody loved those guys in 1 and 2. They're always the highlights of the game when they show up, and they're just not here. It's a game with a bunch of holes and they do nothing to fill them. Barely feels like a Dead Rising game anymore. Just one more example of a series trying to take all the interesting friction out of their games and just it ends up really forgettable. And number 12 is Castlevania Lords of Shadow. The first Lords of Shadow game was divisive, but as a God of War clone, it was one of the best out there with a satisfying campaign and a ton of fun boss fights. There was room for improvement for sure. A sequel could have been truly great, but what we got was, well, interesting, if nothing else. If Lords of Shadow barely felt like a Castlevania game, then I don't know what to say about the sequel. Set mostly in this crazy cyberpunk future, you play as Dracula, battling the literal spawns of Satan. Yeah, the devil is the bad guy in this game, and it's weird. Even for this series, all the demonic imagery, it feels really out of place. This stuff looks like it should be in Doom, not Castlevania.
God is with me, monster.
Setting the game in some kind of fantastical cyberpunk future is far from the only bizarre choice they made for this game, though. There's also a heavy stealth element where, you're Dracula, the king of the vampires, and you have to sneak around and avoid these unkillable cyber demons. Other than maybe Drax's big coat, is there anything here that looks remotely like Castlevania to you? It's not even that the game has stealth, it's that it's bad stealth. Like, if you're going to introduce something completely new to the series, like, it's got to be good. And here's the thing, the combat, it's actually kind of refined over the original game, and the big Metroidvania-like map is a fun touch, but there's just too many problems with this game to just give it a pass. It sucks because there was actually some potential here if they just took what was good from the first game and expanded on that, but instead they just went in a completely different direction for what seems like no reason whatsoever. At number 11 is The Walking Dead Season 2 from Telltale. Season 1 of The Walking Dead is a masterpiece of video game storytelling. Sure, it's not as reactive as they try to make you think, but the core story with Lee and Clem is exceptional. The follow-up, though, well, if there is one game that suffered the second season curse, it is this one. Without Lee at the center, the story becomes kind of aimless and also rushed at the same time. Clem's a good character, but it's kind of bizarre how often a group of fully formed adults end up relying on this child to make decisions for them.
Maybe we should have been more patient. Come up with something better.
It worked.
The plan worked. We got out of there. Most of us.
Like, a lot of the plot beats feel like they come out of nowhere. They feel rushed. And in the case of a certain girl character, they do also feel a bit mean-spirited. I mean, at least compared to the actual Walking Dead show Season 2, something actually happens here. But it's a whole lot of stuff I didn't want to say. At number 10, it's Duke Nukem Forever. I don't think anybody had particularly high hopes for this one in 2011. The game had been a punchline for years at that point, and anybody in the know already knew the game was a disaster of mismanagement, missed deadlines, etc. There was no way this was going to be any good, but it somehow still managed to disappoint. That's how bad this game is. It's a game that feels old in the wrong way. That's the funny thing about it. Like, Duke Nukem 3D, you can return to, and it doesn't feel old in a certain way. It feels like a genre piece. Like, it's a boomer shooter, and it's a good boomer shooter. This game doesn't feel like Duke Nukem 3D. If it had, it would have worked a lot better. Hell, if it was closer to the original trailers that looked like Half-Life ripoffs, it would have been better. But instead of that era of shooter, we got the generic Xbox 360 era shooter. The gray-brown, everything is boring, narrow corridors, you can only carry 2 guns, expanded to 4 later, but at release you could only carry 2, and anytime you get shot, your screen gets sloshed with red jelly. Type shooter. It was kind of a dark time for FPS games, and Duke Nukem Forever took all the worst parts of every console shooter at the time and stitched them together into a homunculus of suck. It's boring and not funny, and most importantly, the shooting is limp as hell. It's bad, it's a poorly made game, and it shut Duke Nukem off for good. The DLC somehow was kind of okay, but that's not enough. At number 9 is Mercenaries 2. You don't hear it get talked about as much these days, but the original Mercenaries on the Xbox was one of the best open world games of all time. It had this novel Deck of 52 system where you had to hunt down the most wanted members of this North Korean regime. You could call in airstrikes or artillery or whatever you needed. There were tons of vehicles to pilot. It was varied. Just a fantastic, kind of archaic game these days, but a very good game. Mercenaries 2 should have expanded on everything that made the first great, but it does not. For one thing, the game is extremely buggy. Like, when it came out, it was practically unplayable. The bugs were that bad. Many of the gameplay systems from the first game got toned down, scaled back, so stuff like artillery was a lot less fun. It was less easy to use. It was also really super short in terms of an open world game. Huge step down from the satisfying campaign of the original. And the Deck of 52 system, cut entirely. There's just way less to do. It does at least have co-op multiplayer, but that's one of the only improvements Mercenaries 2 has over the first game. In every other way, it's a lesser game, a real disappointment of a sequel. At number 8 is Ninja Gaiden 3. Ninja Gaiden Black is an all-time classic. Ninja Gaiden 2, another solid entry that does things a little differently, but it's still great. And then there's Ninja Gaiden 3. Team Ninja didn't even need to farm this one out to Western developers to kill it, they just did it themselves. Everything about this game is so misguided. I honestly do not know what they were thinking here. Combat is simplified, everything's super on rails and linear, and even the notorious difficulty of the series is compromised. Instead of being ball-bustingly hard, it veers wildly between brain-dead easy and controller-smashing type annoying, and there's nothing in between. Difficulty spike, difficulty valley, difficulty spike, difficulty valley. That's how it works. For some reason, there's also a big focus on the story, which is misguided as everything else. You're now a remorseless psycho killer, and the whole thing has this over-the-top edge that felt something, I don't know, like out of a 90s OVA or worse. That's Ninja Gaiden 3 in a nutshell. Like something, but worse. At number 7 is Sonic the Hedgehog 4. Oh boy. It might be hard to believe, but there was actually some hype for Sonic the Hedgehog 4 when it was announced. Originally, it debuted as Project Needle Mouse, and there was a ton of speculation and interest from the fan community about how this potential return to form for the series would go. Remember, it got announced after a string of pretty big stinkers from the Sonic franchise, and not a lot of commitment to the 2D form of Sonic. We all look back on Unleashed a lot more fondly nowadays, because we can kind of separate out the good parts from the bad, but it was still a pretty flawed game, and that was easily the best that came out around this time. So people were ready for a game that would bring back the classic gameplay, and they did not get it. Rather than an actual sequel like the name would imply, they took a phone game they were working on called Sonic the Portable and called it Sonic the Hedgehog 4 instead. I mean, it's ugly, it's got this garish art style, the music is surprisingly bad for a Sonic game, and the controls never stop feeling wrong. There's barely anything even new here. Like they reused mostly ideas from the very first Sonic game. It's not even a third game, it's a third of a game. And Sega had the gall to pretend it was the successor to Sonic and Knuckles, which is pound for pound still one of the best 2D platformers of all time. It's just no good. At number 6 is Lost Planet 3. Now we're getting somewhere. I've been harping on about Japanese companies handing the keys to their franchises over to Western developers for most of this video, but here's a case where that actually happened. Rather than being developed internally like Lost Planet 1 and 2, both of which were interesting, if a little flawed games, Lost Planet 3 was given to Spark Unlimited, the guys who worked on, among other things, Alien Colonial Marines. The only thing that comes to mind is, the results are not pretty. Instead of embracing the offbeat gameplay of the first two games, Lost Planet 3 feels like a subpar attempt to ape Dead Space with a sad dad main character for maximum cliche.
The Earth was a troubled place when I left it. I was 32 when they recruited me. A bold and lucrative opportunity to be part of an expedition to an unexplored world. 50 years ago now. 50 years of living with the consequences of my choices. 50 years since I damned us all.
Nobody plays a Lost Planet game for its story. They want to blast some bugs, and this game is pretty lacking on that front, actually. Shooting, it's not satisfying. Everything feels stiff and kind of off. The first two games, if anything, were responsive, but this game just does not feel good to play. It tries to add to the formula by introducing side quests and a continuous world you can explore, but nothing comes together the way it should. All this random crap interacts awkwardly with each other. Side quests, mostly just annoying busy work and constant backtracking through the same environments that get old pretty quick. Most of all, it just doesn't feel like Lost Planet. Like, say what you will about those games, but they were unique and fun. This game just makes me want to take a nap. At number 5 is Devil May Cry 2. Imagine being hyped for this game after the first. That game was revolutionary for the entire action game genre, and 2 was just a disaster. Everything about it is wrong. I have no idea what the original developers were thinking. Making this after the first game, it feels like a completely different universe. Nothing at all matches up. If there was no Dante, who also looks completely different in this game, you would confuse him with a million other forgettable PS2 action games. The combat is shockingly slow and bad, and like just attacking itself is awkward. Enemies mostly just sort of loiter around waiting for you to kill them. Dynasty Warriors enemies have more of a killer instinct than these guys. Bosses are also pathetic. They're so easy to cheese with the Devil Trigger. It's not just a bad DMC game, it's honestly one of the worst action games on the PS2. It's shocking it got through quality control. Anyone in their right mind would have looked at this, looked at DMC1 and been like, whoa, we are canceling this. That can't go out. At number 4 is Fear 3. Alright, so Western publishers can farm out their series too. This time, instead of Monolith Productions working on the series, it was handed off to Day One Studios, and the results are not pretty. The Fear games were graphical powerhouses at the time. Hell, the original game's lighting and physics engine is still impressive today, and that is not the case with Fear 3. The environments are muddy, the guns look tiny and pathetic, the sound effects, they're flat. The whole experience is kind of a B game energy to it. You can immediately tell it was handed off to lesser developers. They just can't pull off the technical wizardry that Monolith is capable of.
Shit! Nerd! Everyone, eyes!
The biggest problem was the shooting, though. It feels weak. The original game's guns all packed a punch, they felt powerful to use, but everything just feels like a pea shooter here. The new co-op mechanics where player 2 is a ghost who can possess people, it's kinda interesting, but that's the interesting thing in the game. That's the one interesting thing in the game. It's also not actually that much fun to play as. And the campaign, super short. It's mediocre at best, no matter how you look at it. At number 3 is Star Wars The Force Unleashed 2. What happened here? Usually the idea behind making a sequel is it's supposed to be bigger and better. That's usually what happens. Most of the time, sequels are at least as good and sometimes even better than the original games. A lot of the time, the game is almost a proof of concept, and when it does really well, the developer's given the green light to use more resources and go crazy with it. That's why at least the first sequel in a video game series is usually not the problem with it. Kind of the nature of game development, that sequels will have more refined gameplay and visuals.
Where is she? Say something! They are memories of a dead man.
I don't know what the hell happened here. It's probably one of the most unnecessary sequels of all time. It was developed in less than 9 months, which is, by the way, insane at the time, but sounds even crazier now. This game did make a few improvements to the original game. The combat feels a little bit better, but everything else about it is terrible. There's only 4 locations that the game desperately drags out to try to reach game length. You fight Darth Vader in the end in a worse repeat of the finale of the first game, and then it just ends. It's half the length of the already short original game, and they charged full price for it. At least it works for the most part, but that's pretty damning as like the best aspect about it. LucasArts must have been pretty desperate for cash at this time. There's just no other reason why they would have released such a blatantly unfinished cash grab like this so quickly. Now, I'm not saying it's the worst thing. The combat is super fun. There are aspects of the story that are worthwhile too, but it is just missing par by so much.
Don't you want to know where he came from?
At number 2 is Spider-Man 3, the movie game from 2007. Man, remember Spider-Man 2? That game was great. This one, not that Such is the nature of movie tie-in games. Most of the time they suck. Spider-Man 2 was a rare exception. It had an amazing swinging system that just felt good to play. Spider-Man 3 does not. It's a buggy and, frankly, bizarre mess. The only good thing about it are the memes. The part where you mess up a QTE and Spidey explodes is quite funny.
I'm going to die!
And this J. Jonah Jameson cutscene is legitimately insane. Like, what is going on with his arms? Who thought this looked fine? Who thought this was passable? But that's it. Honestly, if you've seen those two things, there's nothing left. You've seen it. Go do something else. I mean, finish watching this video, but like, if you're Spider-Man game browsing, move on. The rest of this game is just terrible, half-baked superhero game garbage. Obviously rushed. The story's meant to connect to the movie, but it makes no sense. It's your usual movie game slop. After Spider-Man 2, we all expected a lot better, but maybe we should have known better. Spider-Man 2 was kind of not something that you should expect to happen.
Spider-Man just showed up!
By holding the sprint button while you run, and hold attack when you get up to the thug.
And finally, at number 1, Driver 3. Sorry, Driver 3 is the name of the game. These days, this series is probably better known as just being an Easter egg in the Grand Theft Auto games. But back in the PlayStation 1 era, the original Driver was super popular. In a lot of ways, it was direct competition to Rockstar. With Driver 3, they tried to swing for the fences, but instead hit themselves in the face with the baseball bat. To call Driver 3 a disaster would be, I think, almost like negligent of the truth, perhaps. Like, it's such a huge understatement. There's just no salvaging this one. It's so buggy. It's practically unplayable. The controls are super unresponsive, very awkward. I mean, look at it. It looks like crap, and it's because it's crap. It's sad because the Driver series did have its own thing going, but instead of sticking to its lane, the publisher wanted some of that Grand Theft Auto money, and this was the result. Was it worth it, Atari, or the undead husk of Atari that was actually GT Interactive? Or, wait, maybe Infro Games? I don't really know. I mean, how is anybody supposed to even make a game when you don't even know who your publisher is? Reflections, you have my sympathy, but unfortunately, Driver 3, is incredibly disappointing. And that's all for today. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications. And as always, thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter, Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time right here on Gameranx.